Hey guys, Brandon Ian here from Flugelbinder. Now it's, as you can see, very apt that we're hosting this meeting via Zoom. It means we're reducing our greenhouse gas emissions, also saving a lot of time. And it's another great way to stay connected. And Ian, it's important we stay connected, right?
Oh, of course. I mean, love and connection, it's so important to us. We've been embracing Zoom, Teams, Skype, you name it, because we ultimately want to be able to connect with our family and friends. Connection is something we inherently need. Like all mammals, we're gregarious. And let's face it, humans have been on the move since we've evolved, and connection helps us reach our potential through thought, compassion for people on the planet around us, and we want to commit to something. And if we don't travel, we don't connect. So yeah, it's pretty important to stay connected.
And that's one of the big issues that we're going to discuss today, and there's quite a few. So as you know, this week has been coordinated by a Global Action Plan and a team of really awesome, dedicated teachers. It's what would have been COP26, and the idea here is to create a number of sustainability action plans and pledges for a more sustainable planet. Now, there's going to be a range of topics. We're going to look at nature, oceans and water. We're going to look at food, farming and forests, fashion and consumption, and then the sustainable future. But today our focus is travel, pollution and waste. Now, where I get really excited is there is hope. The solutions are out there. We need to understand our own impact and our own actions, which relates to sustainable development goal number 12, and also need to work together, which is SDG 17. So these are part of the United Nations SDGs. So Ian, what is the problem?
I mean, it's the fact that we've got to travel. We've got to travel, whether it's locally or internationally. These are reasons being school, business, family, friends, jobs, pleasure. We've got to travel. But are we thinking about the impacts? And probably a better question would be, are the people that should be thinking about it actually thinking about it?
And that's a really interesting point. I know we were discussing this the other day. And as you've mentioned, and you're so passionate about, this generation have really kind of taken on that responsibility, right?
Oh man, ever since I lectured, I think I've come across 500 students. You and I have come across thousands upon thousands of students, and we've woken up a beast. And this generation has basically pushed the old one out of the way and said, all right, we'll sort it out. They've stood up, they take on responsibility, and it's exactly what they're doing. It's exactly what needs to happen.
So if we start and looking at travel, there are alternative solutions. We know locally that we're using cars, we're using public transport, be it buses or trains, and there's cycling or walking. So there's various options we can do to make one of those journeys more sustainable. And we're not saying if you're taking a car, straight away jump to walking, but can you kind of jump one notch up the chain? Can you go from a car to public transport? If you're already taking public transport, can you go to cycling or walking? And also bringing in some elements of mental health and personal development here. Maybe take a different route, a different route to school, whether it's on the way there or the way back, taking the nature, more of a scenic route, and maybe have some time for some mindfulness as well during that. Internationally, it gets a bit more confusing, but don't worry, we'll cover this later on during our session. We need to think about the airlines that we're using, offsetting obviously the carbon and the emissions as a result of that flight, our baggage, how much weight are we taking? Do we need to take the full amount that we're given? What about the meal on the flight? I mean, let's choose a vegetarian option as opposed to a meat option. And actually, once we get to that country, the accommodation and the activities. Now, appreciate for some students, it may not be them that are making these decisions, but actually just having that conversation with their families and friends is going to have an impact and make a difference.
Travel is definitely a good thing though, right?
Of course it is. I mean, as I said, obviously it's one of the biggest contributors towards greenhouse gas emissions, GHGs, but it's also one of the biggest contributors to global GDP. It provides, I mean, when I first started, it was 1 in 10 jobs. A few years ago, it was 1 in 5 jobs, travel and tourism. Last year, it was around 1 in 4. Obviously, COVID's affected that massively, which just shows how much an important industry it is to get moving again. It improves education, housing, health. It can increase infrastructure to give fringe communities access to some of those facilities, as well as water and electricity. And as I mentioned, it also connects us to these SDGs as well.
Yeah, and I mean, travel is the ultimate connecting tool, isn't it? Whether that's boat, rail, road, path, feet, whatever it is to get us there, it literally connects us. And we're doing this for school, pleasure, jobs. We've gone recapping that we said at the start, but we also want to connect ourselves to each other, which is most important for us as we adapt and we grow as a result of new experiences. And we do this by pushing boundaries, and that saying of being comfortable with being uncomfortable, tasting new foods, discovering new places, meeting new people, different cultures. I mean, we've all watched documentaries, nature documentaries, of course, but it's far better to be in one. And I just think the way that we currently thinking, we need to open up our minds to the fact that we're not the only people on this planet, and we have to connect to survive, because connection generates confidence, which encourages enthusiasm, which gives us passion and therefore empathy, confidence, human trait, humanity.
So I think we can all agree that travel's got a number of benefits. We just need to make sure that we're doing it the right way. We need to stop with the all-inclusives and the cruise ships and the cheap option, because there is no cheap option. If it doesn't cost us now financially, it's going to cost us long-term in terms of biodiversity loss, deforestation, ozone depletion, and ultimately climate change. So moving on now to our next topic, we're looking at waste.
Yeah, Brad, you mentioned that travel is one of the largest contributors towards GHGs, but hasn't IT and basically being online overtaken that? I mean, for me, it seems really hard to think that just being on a computer and sending a few emails is far more damaging than taking a flight somewhere.
Yeah, it's crazy. And I only discovered this a few years ago. Travel impact was around 2%. IT is now at 4%. So 4% of GHGs as a result of the IT world. And what we need to remember is that's manufacturing, that's production, that's the shipping. And one of the biggest things is the storage. Now, if you think about all these Amazon and Google data centers of fields and fields, 100 football pitches is the largest one in China. And these are controlled temperature rooms to make sure that data is kept safe and all those servers are kept at the right temperature. That's a lot of energy and a lot of waste. I can't still comprehend how big that is. But coming on to the continuation of waste here, I was flabbergasted to know that laptops and phones are now the world's fastest growing waste problem. I mean, laptops and phones, they're tiny, but when you read into it and you look at the numbers, I think that's where people can resonate with things. 1.5 billion were sold. That's 400 million a day. And 85% of that ends up in landfill, which is just amazing, because all the chemicals that we've taken from the earth and all the ores we've taken from the earth then gets leached back into the earth in a really unhealthy way. And it's unregulated. And the people who work on these recycling processes have masks that are soaked in blood, and all of these chemicals going back into our soils. And it's just a devastating way for us to keep surviving. I mean, that's crazy. Those numbers are so scary. And as you mentioned there, thinking about the health benefits as well is really frightening. So what else is an issue when it comes to waste?
I mean, we've got to touch upon food. I mean, you and I are big food lovers, but I mean, it predominantly comes down to the choices that you make. Plastic wrapping is a huge one. I mean, I think we've both got to think about that. I mean, coconuts, bananas wrapped in plastic. I mean, what's going on? Nature has just provided its natural wrapping for you that biodegrades. I mean, seriously, there's lots of alternatives to use. If you like cow's milk, then try to use a milkman rather than getting the plastic containers. I mean, simple choices that we can make. Something else that we look on here, food wastage. 1.3 billion tons, I think, a year is wasted. That's 3.5 million tons a day. And if you don't know what 3.5 million tons looks like, or even what a ton looks like, imagine a newborn humpback whale. That's roughly 1 ton. 3.5 million of them discarded every day. The irony here is that there's 2 billion people going hungry every night. 1.3 billion of waste, 2 billion going hungry. I mean, how can we push on from that?
It's crazy because a lot of this for me comes back to, as I mentioned before, SDG 12. And Sustainable Development Goal number 12 is thinking about responsible consumption and production. And a few generations ago, there was that line of wants and needs became a very blurry line. I mean, we know from Maslow's hierarchy of needs what our basic needs are. You mentioned earlier, food, shelter, air, water, but then everything else is just consumables. And it's those things that increase production, which increase GHG emissions and ultimately climate action. Now, if global populations are going to reach 9.6 billion by 2050, which are expected to do so, then we're going to need 3 planets to sustain our current livelihoods.
And I've just done the maths and it doesn't check out.
No, one planet.
Mathematics, yeah. I mean, we've got to do something about this now. I mean, what are we simply throwing away? Good point, case in point there. Reusable water bottles. It's one of those things. We don't need to be using plastic water bottles. Not needed. What can you reduce or recycle? Food packaging. We talked about this single-use plastics. Face masks, for goodness sake. I think they found a soft drink can at the bottom of the Mariana Trench. That's not acceptable. But humans, we can come together. We can change together. For example, great case study on plastic was the plastic bag. They introduced a small tariff on it of 5p, and there was 95% reduction of the purchasing and manufacturing of bags in year 1. Simple solution when we all came together. But what are the other alternatives?
I mean, there's so many. I mean, you mentioned food packaging. We explore a lot of these in our workshops, whether it's beeswax wraps, whether it's different types of cloths that we can use, or just a reusable lunchbox or a metal tiffin tin. There's so many options. Single-use plastics, we can look at bamboo cutlery alternatives, bamboo toothbrushes, tote bags, metal straws. I mean, what about face masks? Obviously becoming such a big issue now in schools and a lot of public spaces. But again, let's have a reusable mask. This is a nice challenge for all of you, actually, guys. Speak to your teacher, speak to your school. Let's have a competition of who can make the best face mask. By all means, tag us, Flugelbinder UK at Instagram, and we'll happily send out a bottle and some bamboo cutlery to some of the best ones that we can see online. Now, with a lot of these changes, it all comes from behaviour. And these changes in behaviour are small changes that we can make and making it really easy, making it really convenient, because those small changes, if they're convenient, can become habits, and those habits can make much greater change. So, I mean, finally coming on to our last one, Ian, pollution.
I mean, this covers basically everything in terms of our output. I mean, let's think about how we get to school. That's one of the things that we can directly change, the amount of people that are watching this right now. How many options do people have in terms of taking their bike or the bus or walking or car sharing? I mean, the amount of stories I've heard of watching 10 families following each other to school with the one parent and one child in them with 4 spare seats going. It's so simple to organise. You don't have to do it every day, but you can make these small changes. And as Brad was referring to, these micro-habitats are so important. But then I think it also comes down to eating. Local and seasonal food for us, it's a huge one. Why are we eating pears that are grown in Bolivia and then shipped up to America to be packaged and then sent over to England to be eaten? Just eat something that's local and it's delicious, and you're providing an economy for your local community. If we all looked after our local communities, then the world would certainly be a better place. I mean,
tastier, right? Less chemicals, less packaging, less miles.
That's it. I mean, the less miles, no palm oil, no deforestation, no defragmentation, and all those endangered lovely species and habitats can just keep on thriving, and biodiversity becomes a thing of going upwards rather than going downwards. And then it's that computer time, as you mentioned, being online is a huge contributor, far more than travel, and less computer time, less phone time means less charging. And I think when the telephones used to be tied up, i.e. you had to be stood there on the phone like this, you couldn't go anywhere because you got this big cable, humans were free. And there's so much to say about that, because we would make arrangements with our friends and family and then we'd go and do them rather than keep checking our phone 10, 15, 20 times. You don't need to do that. We put that down, so much better for us, and reduces mental health issues for us as well, which links into being just a bit more outside. There's simple facts that we can throw at you, but I think one of the traits you mentioned earlier is empathy. And if we look at these 2 stats, 5,000 people die every day from drinking polluted water. 6,500 people die every year due to air pollution in Mexico. Now, if you know somebody in Mexico, very simply, you're thinking of them. You're thinking of their face, you're thinking of their name, you're thinking of the family, your friends, the nice times that you had. You'd be worried for them. And that is a sign of empathy. And you can only really gain that from travel, through that ultimate vehicle of connection. And that's why it's so important to monitor everything. And just because pollution is happening in another country, it doesn't mean it's not our responsibility. And this is where we come together.
And I think this shows, doesn't it, how interconnected we are, how our actions here are affecting the communities on the other side of the world. And this is a great place to start where we are. I mean, we just partnered a few weeks ago, Let's Go Zero, that are helping schools achieve carbon net zero by 2030. Now, a lady I've been following the last couple of years, and she was really heavily involved in Extinction Rebellion, followed a lot of her strategies, which was Erica Chenoweth. And she looked at civil rights movements and non-violent civil rights movements. And what she noticed was that if you can get 3.5% of the population on board, you can create change. Now, there's 66.65 million people in the UK, but there's nearly 9 million students. So that's 13%. So if we can just start with the schools, that's got such an incredible place, such an incredible prospect of creating change and connecting into that wider community. So there is hope out there. There is inspiration. There's incredible businesses and incredible people doing amazing things. We just need to think about our actions. We need to talk about it, and we need to act. And just remember, it's small changes and micro habits that can make big changes. So what we need to think about is a little challenge for you guys today. List one thing you can reduce, one thing you can reuse, one thing you can recycle. I'm sure you're all familiar with that. Reduce, reuse, recycle. The fourth one that came into play is repurpose. Now, the difference between reuse and repurpose, water bottle, this you can reuse. Repurpose, a lovely example I saw a few months ago, was an old bathtub that was put outside and turned into a plant pot. So that's something you're repurposing. You're changing the functionality of it. And finally, what can you refuse? That's ultimately the best one. What can we simply not use and not require? So there's a little challenge for you guys. Have fun today. Look forward to seeing some of you later in the workshop, and good luck.